Hello, and welcome to part two of my ongoing conversation with David Verdesi. Today, we talk about avoiding the pitfalls of spiritual fantasies and delusions, escaping false spirituality and practices that actually divert us from achieving our spiritual goals and real spirituality, although they're presented to us as things that, in fact, bring us to spirituality or make our actions seem and feel spiritual. So this is part two of our four-part series. Please enjoy. And if you missed part one, there'll be a link above where you can go ahead and see that too. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Hit the like button and be sure to share this with friends or colleagues who may find it interesting. Welcome to the Transformations Podcast. Here, guests and I will share our transformative experiences and will explore how to find excellence in life.
One of the most important questions that we should always ask ourselves, time and again, it's why do we do what we do?
Right.
And not in a superficial, shallow way, but really dig into this why, because whatever you think is the why, the first story that comes up generally is not it. Trying to understand that whatever sense of free will you have, probably you don't really have. And it is more of a long chain of dependently originated causes and effects from, priming and all the way to epigenetic factors. And of course, nature and nurture that come together and so forth and so on. And makes you who you are with certain volitions. In Sanskrit they call them samskaras. And
Right.
certain, expressions of these volitions. Okay, and we are driven by these volitions, right? And so, and we call them fate. We call them destiny. There is no really such a thing as fate and destiny. It is just the unrecognized unconscious that drives you to want things, towards certain things unconsciously. And so again, you call it fate, you call it destiny. Well, it's my destiny, it's my fate. I'm pulled toward there, or life is mysteriously guiding me there. No, there is nothing mysterious. Yes, it is mysterious. It's your unconscious is mysterious, right? And so that fundamental question of why do you do what you do? Why do you want what you want? Why do you want to do what you do? Why that and not something else? And so this is really a question that I believe is important, not necessarily at the beginning of a personal journey, okay? Because at the beginning, it's good not to know, okay? It's good to just go and try and miserably fail and sometimes succeed, and not knowing allow you a freshness and a spontaneity and kind of a carelessness, which is necessary, I believe, right? But when you get a certain point of your journey, which sort of really never ends, either until you die or until you are, a perfectly enlightened being, at a certain point, you got to start to ask yourself this question: why? And that question can unravel a lot of, sometimes very unsettling answers and unsettling realities, and sometimes very, how would I say, not as fantastic and incredible and highly guided as you thought you were, or your choices were,
Right.
So again, for whoever has reached a certain point in the life, in the journey, and I don't think that this process can really be reached earlier than your mid-late 40s, the famous middle life crisis. Again, is a cliche, but for a reason it's a cliche, because there is a truth in it.
Yeah.
And you start to really be able to think on the why. Okay, is the Plato, the philosopher, spoke of we have two major navigation in life, and so we start our second navigation, the second part of our journey, that is profoundly guided, actually is profoundly informed from having understood the why. We were doing what we were doing. And the funny thing is that when you start to ask yourself the question, the why, very often also another question come up in parallel, for whom you were doing what you were doing. And you say, oh, for myself, or for helping others. Yeah, of course. I mean, that's the nice fairy tales you tell yourself. That's the unconscious talking. But when you make that unconscious conscious, the picture is very different. And so, for example, you will understand that most of the reasons why you were doing what you're doing was because you were propelled by a profound unconscious suffering, trauma, unresolved conflict that you were desperately trying to escape and make sense of it. And a profound sense of disempowerment or disempowerment from your own being, right? Or a sense of self-betrayal, a sense of being abandoned, or a sense of looking for a direction or a guide which you didn't have, right? Looking for love, desperately looking for love, in all the wrong places, but desperately looking for love, right? And then for who you were doing that, that's also quite interesting, because you start to discover that no, it's not true you were doing it for others because you are such a great philanthropist or humanitarian. No, generally you were doing probably for your father or for your mother, right, or to prove them something, to prove them right or to prove them wrong, to prove something to yourself, because they didn't believe in you, and so you had to prove them that you could.
It's and also so
filling... I'm just giving now some
but filling the gap of not feeling loved and not feeling worthy from your parents is a huge
thing.
People are
and say, well, I will do that. Well, because exactly of that gap you took. Until this truth don't hit you so deeply and really wake you up, and you keep living in the bubble, in the dream that, oh, it's my fate, it's my destiny, I'm spiritual, or I'm attracted to do meditation or whatever is it, yoga or qigong or Taoism, or I don't know, whatever is it that runs your boat, right? Well, until you don't make that unconscious conscious, you cannot really talk of a real spirituality, of a real process of awakening, right? And beautifully, Carl Gustav Jung, one of the father of modern psychoanalysis, who also was an avid student and reader of both Buddhism and Taoism, but specifically of Buddhism in his later life, he realized something, and he phrased something so beautifully. He said, you will never become enlightened or awakened by imagining or visualizing figures of light, but by making the unconscious conscious. And it is so very true, because as long as you live in your bubble, believing the stories that you have built up to tell yourself, to comfort yourself, okay, to comfort your narcissistic identities. I am good, and it's beautiful, and I love myself, and others love me because I am this, and that, right? And you think that by visualizing a red ball in your tantien or a light in your, chakra, or I don't know what deity above or around you, that's spiritual practice and that makes you spiritual. No, it does not. And it definitely is not leading you to any sort of awakening or enlightenment. And this is shocking. It's shocking when you come to realize that.
Right.
Because it brings you from a state of hubris, of arrogance, of false potency, to a state of humbleness, to a state of an innocent ignorance, where you realize that actually whatever you thought you know, you don't. And from that doubt and that question, then the second navigation, the second part of the journey begin finally from a state of relative awareness of those unconscious forces that were driving you and that you were calling fate and destiny. So this is really probably my call nowadays. It's to make people think in this direction. And so it's interesting, I was reflecting that the Buddha, after his awakening, supposedly waited for whatever is it, 7 weeks or so, or 9 weeks or whatever, how long, right, before he started to teach. And in the 7 weeks, he contemplated probably many things, which we will never know. But we know for a fact that when he started to teach, he proclaimed the famous, 4 noble truths. And the first of this truth is the realization of suffering, of the traumas, the unresolved conflict, okay, the denied, disavowed, abandoned, betrayed part of our being. That suffering has a very psychological dimension, and very often people start to think of the Buddhist truth of suffering and something, well, life is suffering, or in some grandiose philosophical term. No, he really meant it in the most profound, deeply psychological level. The beginning of the process of awakening is the recognition of your own pain, suffering, the forces, the unseen, unconscious forces that shaped you. That fundamentally means the early dynamics between your father and mother, if you were so lucky to have them, and between your father and you, your mother and you, and your father and mother as an entity and you, and vice versa. Okay, between you and your father, you and your mother, you and the dynamic, the entity of the couple dynamic. Okay, and so from this early suffering of unrecognition, of denial, of abandonment, of betrayal, of being unloved, the core of your psychic identity is formed. And that is really what propels you to do what you do. That is really your why, your unseen, honest, true why. And you have to make that conscious before you can really say, well, I'm on let's say, on a journey to awakening. Because the Buddha say, the path to nirvana, to awakening, well, begin with the recognition of that suffering inside yourself first. And it hurts. And you have to let it hurt. It makes you cry when you really start to feel it. And there is so much pain that you covered with building your narcissistic persona of the martial artist, or of the yoga teacher, or of the Taoist, or of the Qigong master, or of the yogi meditator, I don't know, whatever, biohacker, whatever now is fashionable to do, right? And so when the narcissistic identity crumble and it finally hits you, the mysterious forces that were driving your life and the truth start to come out. Sat, the truth, shall set you free. What does it mean? it's only when the truth of your being start to finally be spoken, well, that's the beginning of being free from the lies, of being free from the power of the unconscious that drive you and drives what you do and why you do. And from the freedom, well, is the birth of a new awareness. I call it that humble ignorance, that humble doubt, that question that finally can begin the second truth, right? And the first truth is that there is a suffering, and the second truth, and the third, and then the fourth truth is fundamental, is that, well, this suffering has an origin, okay? And after you understand it, well, within the origin, there is the solution. So, and that solution is the way out of it. And then there is a path. And that path, if you follow it, is very psychological and therefore universal. It's not culturally defined, right? But is the psychological matrix, is the algorithm that doesn't matter where you're born, it's still valid. And that one, I believe, was the profound insight of the Buddha at the time, right? Which then went on to inform, Hinduism at large, because let's remember that, the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali, the very earliest, beginning of the yogic tradition, is actually, a crypto-Buddhist, path. And so the earliest tantras as well are actually Buddhist in origin. He went to influence Taoism, because let's remember that the very earliest Taoist sect, the Shanxing, all the earliest texts, I mean, it's Buddhist deities that were channeled and by this lady and early sort of founder of the earliest Mao Shan tradition and all the divine purity tradition and so forth and so on. And there were sort of Buddhist deities that actually gave the very earliest Taoist transmission. So it's quite interesting, and it's right there in the literature if you really look. And so how profound this insight was, just now to stick to Asia, right? And then we remember that Ashoka, the first Buddhist emperor, converted to Buddhism in the 3rd century before Christ, okay? He sent 80,000 monks to the West, and that means, to Greece, to the Mediterranean basin. And well, it informed the Hellenic period, which then formed all the, Neoplatonic and Plotinus and all the way sort of to Christianity and so this profound insight, which was again deeply psychological in nature, it was a revolution. And we don't appreciate how deeply it informed all the practices that most people nowadays do in pursuit of a spiritual achievement, okay?
Yeah.
And so going back, why? And this one very often, it takes help. It takes a mentor, it takes a teacher, it takes a psychologist to help you to really break down that why and make it conscious, okay? There are huge resistances of not wanting to see that and rather believe, the story of your narcissistic identity. It's much nicer, okay? So after you go to the process of asking yourself the why and start to make the unconscious conscious, well, then you can finally start to define. And, last time we were discussing about this. What does it mean to be spiritual? And you have to define it to yourself. Well, what is spirituality? And that's maybe something I wanted to go a little bit more in depth. But what does it mean to be spiritual for you? And you have to really, really, define it, determine it for yourself in such detailed ways, which very often escaped you. You never thought about it. And that's the second part, I would say, of the story. And when you do this process, you will understand that, well, probably many of the things that you thought were part of being spiritual or of spirituality actually are not. They are just rituals, liturgies, habits, or cultural appropriation very often, which you propped up and you thought that, okay, well, by doing this and that, I'm spiritual, or that's spirituality. And when you finally start to really analyze it and understand, you discover that they are not. And then, well, what's left? It's a very difficult part of the journey to arrive at this honesty. I mean, I can speak for myself. And that process, leaves you naked, because all the things that you used to cover yourself up, to prop yourself up, well, they don't have power because you have seen through the deception. And that truth set you free, but also leave you naked. And it's like, okay, who am I now? What am I doing now? Where am I going now? And how do I redefine spirituality and what it means to be spiritual? Is it even interesting at all for me? A lot of people that they think that they're interested in being spirit and spirituality, actually they're really not. So they just do it because, they are desperate and sad in their relationships, and they cannot forge a proper healthy relationship, or they are trying to escape from a painful one, or they try to avoid, intimacy, and, or well, are people that actually are trying to make a buck, and beyond and behind all their spiritual things is just because they have no better way to make money. Okay. Or then there is, well, the people that subtly are after an idea of a fantasy of power. That one was, I have to say, that was definitely one of my shadows. Okay?
Yeah.
And you do this because you subconsciously believe that either it's going to give you some kind of power over knowledge of a higher nature, that when you really question, why do I need it? You really can't really tell yourself why, but somehow you think you need it. Okay, well, no, it's not for others. It's not to control others. It's to control myself, or to have access to my higher nature, to better communicate. We got just nonsense.
Bullshit. Yeah.
But you can't get out of the lies that you are telling, or the non-truth that you're telling, right? And in the fantasy of power, very often there is the whole idea of a superior health, being forever young, that is a projection fantasy of invincibility, invulnerability, okay, which is a problematic of the narcissistic identity, that it's untouchable, perfect, invulnerable, and never changes, right? It's perfect, and it's kind of separated from the world somehow, right? And so that's very often the third shadow of well, what people think they do, what they want when they do spiritual practices. And of course, it's very well and covered.
Yeah.
And so when these three shadows, lies, fall apart, and you start to look, and it's like, well, I dropped one, or maybe, that one was not mine, or this one is not mine, but maybe I have this one and now it doesn't make sense anymore, or I don't believe it anymore. Again, how do we redefine what means to be spiritual and what is spirituality? And do I really need it? Am I really interested in that? Right.
You said a tremendous amount that needs unpacking. So I don't believe we have free will either, because a lot of people do, I don't believe it, because I know that from an early age, we are programmed to think and act and make choices the way we do, from television, parents, society, schools, teachers. So that's no longer free. That's their programming in you. So until you get rid of that to be a free thinker, you can't have free will, no matter what. You have to, when you're talking about getting down to the why, and you're realizing you're making choices based on your genetics, epigenetics, or this, the doctor said this, like, there's no free will. we're completely, I believe we're completely controlled by that programming that is good intention put in us in many cases. But I think there is, the self-fulfilling prophecy, and on our way to be self-actualized, we can be on that path, even if it's not by the choices we're making aren't by free will. So if you want to be a Taoist priest or a Qigong master healer, and you do all the steps to study and get the knowledge and the skills and the techniques to get there, and you become one somehow, then that's your self-fulfilling prophecy. But the fact that you're going and looking for that and trying to do that, and which teachers you're going to and what you're able to do, I don't think is free will. That comes in through programming. This advertising says this is the best grandmaster and I'm going to take his course, and then I'm going to travel to Thailand because he's got the biggest monastery, or he'll take Western students. That's all programming.
Yeah,
you have to get past.
Absolutely, and it goes deeper than that. I mean, we always like to believe some romantic stories of why we're interested in these things, but again, when you really have a microscope and you can look under, you will see a network of forces at play that started to play probably even, well, at birth, if not when you were in your mother womb, right? And maybe it's influenced the 7th generation down the line through epigenetic information in the intergenerational trauma of what your mother and father went through and their grandparents and great-grandparents went through, right? So you don't know. And there is no way to fully 100% know it. But if you can at least untangle a little bit of that unconscious and understanding that you were driven and pushed by forces which generally are traumatic forces, or pains or suffering or traumas or unresolved conflict, to go in a certain direction, as you say, to become a healer or a priest or whatever is it, a master of some sort. And then you say, well, then there is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Yes, of course. And sometimes that prophecy is your graveyard.
Yes.
Because you become the embodiment of your unresolved traumas and conflict. You become the embodiment of the unresolved unconscious. Great. And now that you are that, now you have built up this whole identity, which is just another, constructed narcissistic identity. I'm a master, I'm a healer. Then what? It's interesting, that this reflection, that probably they seem very kind of dark or not very positive, come after a lifetime of search, of experience, and also after a profound examination that you do. And so my invitation here is, don't be afraid of going through this process for yourself. Because on the other side of this apparently chaotic phase of difficulty, shedding the lies and allow the truth to emerge that will set you free, well, then there is the other side, and it's beautiful. And so I don't want people to sort of feel, demotivated.
Well, like you say, though, after you've shed that and you realize like all that stuff is illusion and ego, and then you're sitting naked outside in the cold by yourself and it's dark and you're like, now what? Who am I? Why am I here? What do I do? And how do I find out the next step for the truth to get to that beautiful landscape you just mentioned? There's that little purgatory in between, the shedding before you get to this. So what are some tools people can do, or methods to start examining, to bring the unconscious into consciousness and examine to know what they can and can't shed? What are some tools to help people who don't have a clue?
Question yourself. We are all given the same tools, and you don't need to go and search for some metaphysical. I call it our probably 7th sense.
Mm-hmm.
And you know which is? Conscience. Conscience. We all know. We all know. Deep, deep, deep down, And so conscience is just a sense that is conveniently not utilized very often. But we all have it, and it can't be denied. Like, you know when you break the laws of love. You know when you do something that isn't right. You know, everyone knows. You don't need anyone to teach you that. You know. And you know when you lie, and you know when you are true. And so to help to wake up this seventh sense, this conscience, question yourself. Question your motivations, questions your reasons, question your history. And this one is a very good question you ask, because it's part of what I'm going toward next. If you have access to a teacher whom you trust and somehow you believe embodies whatever ideal you have of what a teacher should be, ask them to help you. If you don't have that, well, find a good psychologist and ask. Let them ask the questions, and you are in a position where you maybe can give some answer that is honest. Stay away from the spirit told me I had a vision, and I saw this and I saw that. Those are the hypnosis or whatever other means, trance or channelers, and so because they will just talk to you in metaphors and allegories which you take to be true, or you will not be able to really disentangle, and very often you will give them the meaning that you want to give them, not the meaning they necessarily have. That's a big part of what I do. I mean, when someone come and seek me out, they call it Coffee with David. And I just go through this process of taking them apart. And it's difficult. Many cry, many adults, men. And it doesn't take 5 minutes. Sometimes I need a few weeks to do this. So why I'm saying this is not because you have to do it with me, but because it's a process that doesn't happen in a day or in an hour. You have to submit yourself to scrutiny and examination pretty ruthlessly over a period of time.
You were leading into a process, and you said after you've shed, you've brought the unconscious conscious, you've worked through, you're sitting naked, and what is the next step to move out of that, to get dressed and start life again?
Once again, it comes that fundamental step of taking pen and paper and really, start to define for yourself into the minute details. What does it mean for you? What do you believe it means to be spiritual, and what you think spirituality is, right? And you really have to take your time for it. And again, a lot of things, maybe you write them and then you read them and say, okay, I'm going to change them. And then eventually when you get to that definition, I think that's really the next most important step. And as you see, you don't need any esoteric meditation to do that. You just need your intellect and pen and paper. Okay, your mind and pen and paper, and again, some self-honesty, and really, put it down. Okay. In the process of writing down and defining for yourself, okay, what is it to be spiritual and what is spirituality, you will stumble upon this profound imprint that derived from being immersed in this, Abrahamic culture. If you were born and raised in the West, of course, if you're listening this and you were born and raised in India or China, might be completely different, of course, right? But, I'm talking now for people like you and I, for example. You'd be surprised to discover that your ideal is informed by actually a cultural fantasy. And I mentioned this the previous time, right? that idea of spirituality and of the guru is this, I call him the floating pink Jesus, you know, always good, always kind, never angry, never aggressive, all forgiving. Beautiful, very romantic picture, okay? Floating on clouds and, you know, hugging children and, you know, blah, blah, blah. It's very sweet, but it's very far from the truth. First of all, because that character is just a meta structure that was, it's a fiction that was emerged, okay, from an underlying structure, but doesn't even exist in the literature that gave birth to it. Because if you go and look at the roots of Abrahamic cultures, okay, and, you know, from the Torah to the Talmud, all the way to the Hebrew Bible, and then, you know, the Christian Bible, and then the New Testament and the Gospels, and then eventually, you know, the early stage of the Quran, and, you know, blah, blah, blah. You will see that this version of Jesus and of the spiritual man, of the doesn't exist in the scriptures. It doesn't. You know, this guy, this Jesus character was a very hot-blooded character, which was very often lashing out and let's be honest, pretty angry, okay, in many, in his words and, you know, in many of his actions, and so many examples of that, too many really to be counted or recounted. And before, I mean, you know, again, from where this idea, this character Jesus emerged from, you know, we go back to the Hebrew Bible and then the Hebrew tradition, and hey, I mean, the Hebrew God, it's no, you know, sweetie pie. It's a very tough warrior lord, jealous and vengeful, and I don't know how many people he killed. Millions. The numbers, statistical number of how many people, you know, the Abrahamic God kills, it's millions. Millions. Okay. So from where this fantasy that to be spiritual, it means to be, you know, the white tunic Jesus, then associated with the idea of the Indian guru with the turban and the nice pajama and so forth and so on. Well, it doesn't exist, or if it exists, most of the time is just a facade, is an illusion. You know, and then, you know, we have the Beatles, the 1960s, you know, the Maharishi and the Transcendental Meditation movement, dressed in white and good, you know, and of course, you know, that no violence, the ahimsa culture. Well, and then it got superimposed to this other character idea of Jesus, the sweet and kind guy, and so we have such a mess in the head with things that don't really match reality. Now, not many people know or understand that even the whole idea of the modern Indian guru, it's a very modern concept that really was pretty much created by Gandhi. I mean, not really created by him, but it's like, you know, exemplified by him. Okay, and that before that time, even vegetarianism in India was far from popular. Okay, and that the very source of the Hindu tradition, the Vedic tradition, they were meat eaters. And I challenge everyone, you know, to say otherwise. You know, just read the Vedas. Just actually read the actual Vedas. Okay, and then the Puranas, and then the Brahmanas, and, you know, and then, you know, blah blah blah. Even the early yogic text. So even this whole idea that we have of the ahimsa, the you know, the non-violence, and so, which is steeped into the Jain culture, you know, and then in the 19th, 20th century Indian nationalism, the embodiment of Gandhi, it is something that doesn't really exist thoroughly so as we imagine it to be in the history and historical context. And so when we start to put down on paper our ideal of spirituality and what it means to be spiritual, a lot of these cliches will start to come out. And then when you start to write them down, well, you realize that they are unfair and unrealistic, because no human being is like this. Just no human being is like this. Well, maybe a completely realized Buddha, maybe, right? But no human being is like this. And all the yogis and saints, the whole idea of Jesus Christ and and Mohammed, or the Jewish patriarchs, just look at their life and their histories. A lot of emotions, good and bad, and anger, and then forgiveness, and then pity, and then sadness. And I lived with enough yogis and shamans and monks of different tradition, from Hindu to Buddhist to Christian to Taoist, to tell you that. And I live with sifus and gurus of different sorts. I live with them. I didn't read books. I didn't just for a seminar of a week. I actually live with them for months, sometimes years. So I got to see them. And trust me, they are not the fantasy projection that you think they are. No. And so in this process of describing for yourself what does it mean to be spiritual and spirituality, you will face a lot of this cliche, but then you will also have to question them. Is really this the meaning of it? Does it really match reality in history when we look at it historically? Okay, and then you will start to realize, well, wait a second, it doesn't really. A lot of these great saints, yes, they had moments and they had expression of great love and fortitude and kindness and compassion, but they also had moments of being pretty stern and harsh, even, right? And so in the process of describing for yourself what it means to be spiritual, you also have to come to terms with the truth that the fantasy that you have created doesn't necessarily match the reality. And so if you create for yourself an impossible ideal and you try to match that ideal, well, you are falling into a delusion because you are trying to match a fantasy, and the fantasy can never be real. Yeah. It's like the fantasy of the perfect man and the perfect woman, the perfect father and the perfect mother. Okay, it doesn't exist. They are human beings. And so they have all sides together. And so yourself, when you write down very, very precisely what does it mean spirituality, you have to be careful not to fall into a delusion, a fantasy of perfection, which is a fantasy. And so gradually you have to turn down the definition into something that is real and realistically achievable, so that then you can actually start to, understand how well do you match it, and what do you need to match it. And it's real and realistic, so it's achievable, because the fantasy is not achievable, because it's not real. So this one it's very important.
I think if you take out the fantasy and the projections that we all have, people don't then know what does it mean to be spiritual, right? So exactly. if it's not floating on clouds and seeing the angels in your head and being pious and forgiving,
24/7, because the fantasy is that this is an unchanging state 24/7. Okay?
Right.
Moment to moment, we all have our moment of love and communion with
the divine. Right. I mean, you've traveled all over the world, living in monasteries, living in the forest, living in caves, studying and apprenticing with dozens of masters and shaman. And if all of that to you doesn't mean spiritual, and you saw through the veil of it, you saw through the projections that you had toward that, and that we all have, the guy sitting in a cave has to be super enlightened and talking to God, or, he wouldn't be doing it. But it's not true. So at the end of that process that you've come to, and you've brought the unconscious conscious, where do you sit in terms of what is spirituality?
I think that is the question that really hit the nail, and it is one of the things that I try nowadays to bring to people whenever I talk to people. We're really coming to the core.
Yeah.
And it is interesting you mentioned, my experiences in my past, which were really sort of fairly diverse. And there was an underlying common ground, which I nowadays believe is probably a safe, basic determination or definition of what spirituality is. And let's be careful, because what spirituality is and is not necessarily what's the purpose of spirituality. Yeah? And it definitely has nothing to do with filling your tantien with energy or spinning your chakra or talking with the angels or having astral bodies or whatever, developing immortal fetuses or whatever. And so the underlying definition, it is way more simple and at the same time way more complex. And I will pull it back in our sort of cultural frame to make it clear. Now, I'm sure you heard of the word Satan. I think everyone has. It's a Semitic word in its etymology. And in its etymology, it means to whisper. And the whisper are the voices in our head. Modern neuroscience says that we roughly produce 80,000 thoughts per day. It's an enormous amount. Those are the voices, those are the whispers. These thoughts are produced, well, not because there is a bad guy named Satan out there, but they are produced by the very hardwire that, the casket of our physical body. It's a very complex process of why and how they are produced, but they are produced. It's a matter of fact. And these 80,000 thoughts, they go through a very complex filtering and process. And so what they emerge at the level, not even of the fully conscious, but at the level of the subconscious is probably only 800. And then from the chaos of the subconscious, what really moves to the conscious is maybe like 100 of them. And so we all roughly kind of deal every day with a media of 80, 100, more or less thoughts, voices, because thoughts appear in our head as like dialogues, voices. What is interesting is that 90+% of these voices, of these thoughts, they are actually, well, let's say they're not about loving kindness. They are about survival, they're about competition, they're about prognosis or prediction of danger. They're about protection, they're about survival, okay? They're about, well, you did this to me, and you did that to me, and this scenario could happen, and I need to do this to protect myself or my family, or I need to find the best advantage in the situation. And so only about 10% of these, so roughly 8, maybe 10 thoughts per day, maybe, are actually thoughts of love, of goodness, of joy. It's staggering. From 80,000 to 8. And again, those are not precise numbers, but they give a sense. Think about it. During your average day, okay, how many thoughts, moments are thoughts of, with emotion of love and joy and goodness? Think about it. Scaringly, there are very few. It's maybe when you come back from work and you see your wife or your children, maybe when you wake up in the morning, maybe when you smile and you have, a little chat with a friend of yours, but let's be honest, they are incredibly few. All the other thoughts, all the other voices, it's a war of what we need to do to survive, to defend ourselves, to thrive, compete, succeed, to stay strong, to be healthy, to avoid danger. And there is no way out. Every day is the same because our brain is designed to produce thoughts. Okay?
Often we're reliving the past and relitigating the past in our
Oh,
head and
that's of course.
projecting the future,
Oh, of course.
conniving the future.
That's all another dimension then. Of course,
right.
then the majority of these thoughts then they are, as you correctly say, reenacting the past or imagining future scenarios, blah, 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 blah. But it goes the same way.
Yeah.
And so that's Satan. Those are the whisper, and that's the adversary. And Satan manifests as, as the devil, they say. And it's interesting because the word devil actually, it's from Greek etymology. So, one is interesting because the idea of the devil is from the Greek diavallos, that means to separate, to divide.
Mm.
And so the result of this whisper of these thoughts, it's a divide and conquer. Is the work of the devil is to separate, and it separates us into many identities, into many selves that fight different worlds, that live different lives. They separate us from love. They separate us from ourselves. They separate us from reality. And so we live in a constant neurosis. Neurosis in psychology is defined as a state of separation from reality. Well, hello, welcome. It's sort of our default condition merely. This is very interesting because right here lies the actual only, well, maybe not the only, but definitely one of the underlying common denominator across all culture is to wage a fight with the adversary, with the whisperer, with the forces that separate. And so all the hero journey, it's the hero that with a sword in the hands and a few allies goes and fight the dragons. Okay, and in one way or in another, okay, it doesn't really matter, from the myth of Gilgamesh, all the way to more modern myth. Okay, but it's this rather childish metaphor, but it's actually very deep and very profound. Okay, because it's really what's happening and what spiritual practice is about. So what does it mean in practical sense? Well, it means the spiritual practice, it comes down to the awareness that you have of those voices. And so the first step of spiritual practice, of spirituality, it's to become aware of what are your satans, what are your whispers, what are your devils, the forces that separate you. And each of us has his own. Okay, and you have to start to recognize them. And so that's why the beginning of the spiritual journey, well, the way that I did it more than once, you have to go into a retreat silence. Because when you shut your mouth, what happens? Your mind starts to talk very loud, so loud. And then you can really, really hear the devil, the Satan talking to you. You are this, you are that, or you are not this, you are not that, or you should do this and you should do that, or you shouldn't do this and you shouldn't do that, or whatever, right? This person is that. All these voices start to talk. And so silent retreat, first thing. And after you close your mouth and you actually start to listen to the noise, to the inside, you realize that there is a war going to maintain your sanity, to hold and don't listen to these voices. And so the first part of spiritual practice is to recognize, to hear these voices, not to try to shut them down, but to actually hear them. to actually get to know them. And the second step is to question them. Is it really true? Do I really need to believe what this voice is saying about myself or about someone, about what I should do, about who I am or about who that person is? And in this process, you discover something incredible, that these voices, your demons, your satans, when they speak to you, they speak with very precise voices and with very interesting faces. Maybe it's the voice of your mother, maybe it's the voice of your father, maybe they have the face of your mother and father, maybe it's your spouse, maybe it's your boss. But you will come to see that there are maybe it's your own voice, maybe it's your own voice, maybe it's your own face, of course, right? But you will come to see that these satans, they speak to you with unique voices and unique color that you start to identify. And then you start to understand, and that's, you know, the deeper step, that these masks, these personas, the faces and the voices that they speak to you with is not their true voices. It's just the mask that they put on to speak with you, to lead you into temptation, to make you fall, because they know that you are weak when they speak to you with your own voice, with your own face, or with your mother, father, spouse, or boss face. And so you start to unmask them, and then you can start to ask them, show me your real face. Tell me your true name. And as you can name your devil, as you can name the Satan, well, that's when you can start to get back in control. You know, it's the base of exorcism. That's when you can start to cast them off, when they break the control over you. And again, I am now using the metaphor of our Abrahamic Judaic culture, but mind, that in Buddhism, in Hinduism, in Taoism, in Shamanism, in every single culture that I have lived and practiced with, is the same. You know, you just change a little bit the names of the characters, but it's really the same.
Yeah.
So that's what I say, that this is the underlying common denominator definition of what is spirituality and spiritual practice. That's the real work. Thinking about filling your energy with your tantien, it's just mindless waste of time. It's not spirituality. It's not gonna bring you anywhere, if not to momentarily interrupt the noises in your mind, because you anchor your mind into another task, which is fine, which is very important. And so they tell you mindfulness of breath, mindfulness of movement, mindfulness of emotion. Very good. Those are hooks and anchors, because when you start to engage the fight with the adversary, that is the voices of your own mind, the wind and the turmoil, it's big. Okay, and so you need some anchor, you need some faith. And this faith sometimes can be, you know, a very practical thing, a prayer with a mala, or again, returning on your breath, or returning on the mantra sound, or okay, engaging into, you know, doesn't matter, liturgy, lighting an incense. Those are anchors in the process that, you know, when the mind is engaged, when you are engaged, but they help you. They don't do the work for you. Okay, so it's something that you need, and that's why you need a discipline. You need a spiritual discipline, and it doesn't really matter what is it, as long as it works for you. Lighting a candle in front of a picture or a statue, or doing a form, or coming back to your breath, or thinking of your tantien, it's all great. There is no one that is higher or lower, okay? Because you understand now what is the real value of these practices, of these exercises. Then what happens? If you engage the battle long enough, you start to gain sovereignty, and you start to be able to discern the spirit within. What does it mean? To whom all these voices are talking to? Who is hearing these voices? I am. Very good. Where are you? The sense of self, it's invisible, it's lost, it never appears. The enemy appear, the voices appear, the temptation appear, the light in the tantien or in the chakra appear, the angels appear, but the self, who are the voices talking to? Who is experiencing the tantien? Who is looking at the tantien? Who is moving the energy around? That sense of self is invisible. And you cannot, it's like an unformed cloud, it's lost. And third stage of spiritual practice is when finally you can discern who is hearing the voices. And then the word comes from within. You find your own voice. In the beginning, you will not find your own face. You start to find the word. You can start to pronounce, to talk back to these voices, to these forces, to these desires, these volitions, these fantasies, these projections, these temptations, these memories. And you start to find the voice. You finally start to find yourself. And that's really when the practice begins. And before you start to find yourself, there is a moment of silence. And so what most people think that spiritual practice is that when they do their mantra, their meditation, or their movements, and then there is this stillness. That is just the stage before the beginning, when through whatever exercise you have done, you have managed to put a little silence in all this noise. And in this silence, you experience yourself connected to nature, whatever, expanded in a state of gratefulness, of resource, of joy. Very good. Okay? You need to stay there long enough until you can get a hold of yourself. Who is in the state of stillness? To whom the voices are talking to? Who is engaging and wielding the sword? That is spiritual practice. And you hold on to that through your day when 1,000 thoughts come at you. Resilience, sovereignty, and a discipline is what constitutes the core of a spiritual practice. But you need to know what you need to do, what is important to do. Not wasting time thinking that visualizing a figure of light out there or in here constitutes spiritual practice or spiritual progress or makes you spiritual. It has a purpose. Yes, it is an anchor. Yes, it is important. Yes, but in and on itself is not the spiritual practice and is not spirituality.
So if we talk about consciousness, they talk about who is the person observing your thoughts, or who is what is the thing observing your thoughts? What is the thing observing your argument in your head? If that's our greater consciousness, why can't this consciousness that's observing the bad thoughts in my head not turn them off? Just have the power to say no.
First of all, I don't necessarily, agree with the use of these terminologies of consciousness and so forth and so on.
Okay.
That's a long conversation. But let us say that the illusion that you can have an empty mind and no thought is another illusion. Because the brain is wired. The mind produces thoughts like your adrenal glands produce adrenaline.
Yeah.
It's the purpose of the mind to think and to produce thoughts, and is supported by the brain. So you cannot not produce thoughts. Thoughts will always be produced.
So you want to produce the better thoughts and not the negative.
Well, you also really can't do that, because 3/4 of our brain, from the stem to the mammalian brain, it's designed to produce thoughts that are not negative, but are thoughts of survival. Okay, and your brain is an instrument, is a machine that creates scenarios. Okay, we are incredible at creating scenarios, predictive algorithms to see, different outcomes and, what best suit us for our survival and our thriving. So you can't change that. And again, you see, that's another of the many illusions. That's not what spirituality is about, or what you should aim at. Although, definitely, you will notice that when you engage in spiritual practice as you really is, well, the power and the forces of these memories, which are fundamentally memories, okay, or predictive sort of avatars of our predictive algorithms, okay, so future things, they gradually have less power over you. And so, well, yes, it's true that you find in a position of be able to maintain, produce, and wield and pronounce more thoughts and emotions, let's say, that are prefrontal cortex, more caring, more kind, more considerate, where there is more joy, more presence, more gratitude, more awe, more, for sure. That is true. And so someone that engages in spiritual practice will be, well, at the beginning, will be fighting a very long and dark, heavy fight with his own, demons and satans. But after a period, and it can be years, so it's not again something, a week or a month retreat or 6 months retreat. No, it's long. Well, yes, then it's true that you definitely will be able to experience less state of neurosis and an higher state of, for lack of better word, of happiness and joyful thoughts. And, and you think of this Buddhist man, Mathieu Ricard, they say he's the happiest man alive, and they measure all his brains and they notice that actually, well, we can actually measure, right, that his brain produces higher level of, gamma waves, higher integration, even lambda waves, which have never been seen in a human being or in any other living form before. And so that you live in a state of expanded love and joy. Yes, that is the result of the work. So it's possible. But I think that a lot of people don't want to go through and don't understand the very root and beginning of the definition of spirituality and spiritual practice, what's really is, right? And so now if we move from our kind of Abrahamic definition to, let's say, a more Asian, we go back to Buddhism, but also, to Hinduism. Well, they say, the Buddha say, one of the 4 foundations of mindfulness, you got to be able to look at your own mind. Okay, and so all these thoughts arise. And so if you go and do a course of shamatha, they call it vipassana, but actually shamatha, and 10 days or 1 month, you are in silence. And what you do 15 hours a day, well, you sit there and you go through and as an observer of these thoughts, these voices that arise, and instead of interacting with them in an erotic way, starting the whole dialogue with your own dialogue, right? You learn to hear them, and as they say, to let them go, right? Buddha say the image of clouds in the sky. They come, they go. So you don't need to be pulled by their magnetism. But this is easier said than done, because these thoughts have an incredible magnetic power. These memories of these projections, incredible. You sometimes you just can't resist. Okay, think of sexual urges or any of our basic human cravings, right? Okay, sometimes they are so strong that it's easy to say, oh, well, I can just sit and look. Or pain. Okay, well, it's not. They really pull you. And so we go back, what is spiritual practice now? We move from the Abrahamic definition to, let's say, the more Asian definition. It's the same. That's what I say. It's the same thing. It's to be able to, well, take a grip over yourself and sit like an unmoving mountain, and with an incredible determination, I shall not move, and remain there and not engaging with all of these voices, the maras they're calling Buddhism, right? That come and go and suggest you things, and you don't engage, you question them. This is not real. So they say neti neti is the classical system. Not this, not that. Not this, not that. Not this is myself, not that is myself. The Buddha himself said explicitly, you know, you look at all these things and you realize this is not me, this is not I, this is not myself. One by one, as they appear, and you just vipassana, see through. Vipassana means to see through, to see clearly. And so, again, it's the very same job of the Abrahamic. And if I would describe it to you in the shamanic tradition, it's still the same. That's the practice. So in this practice, you see, there is nothing about mysterious energies, channels, chakras, and tantien. No, it's all done within here, within this, you know, this little box, spiritual practice. Then when you finish that, do you eat meat, you don't eat meat, you smoke, you don't smoke, you drink, you don't drink, it's irrelevant. You have sex, you don't have sex, it's irrelevant. This culture tell you this, another culture tell you that. To the Christians, they say, well, to the late Christians, it wasn't like this in the beginning, but you know, nowadays, you know, the cliche goes, oh, well, you can't have sex, but you can drink, okay, and smoke. Well, you go to the Muslim and you can have sex, but you cannot drink, okay. You go to another culture, you know, you can, for example, in Bhutan, okay, so in Tibetan Buddhism, it's interesting. You can drink, alcohol is okay, but you cannot smoke because it damages your nadis and your prana, blah, blah, blah. You go into another culture, well, you know, you eat meat. In our Christian tradition, you go to Christian monasteries, they eat meat.
There's some Buddhist traditions that say you can't eat onion and garlic.
Yeah, or whatever. And then you go to the Hindus and they say that, you know, you cannot eat, you know, garlic and onion or whatever. So this is the proof that it doesn't matter. Because if they are not a universal substrata, and you find the monk and the yogi that become enlightened and awakened in one way or in another way, it means that that is not a determining factor. Clearly so. Because that's not spiritual practice. We have defined what is spiritual practice. Okay, what is actual spirituality is the discipline of engaging your own self, your own mind, this battle. That is it. Then outside of that, those are cultural fabrication. That's a cultural context, which changed dramatically in the past few thousand years, and it's dramatically different from one culture to another, and it's not determining of the fact that you are spiritual or not spiritual. Then, well, they say, but you know, can you reach all the way through by drinking, smoking, and having sex? You don't need to worry about that. You do your journey, you do your actual practice, and then when the time arrives, if the time arrives, and you have brought this process, you know, far enough, well, you will naturally notice that these desires, they fall away. Even in the tantric Buddhism, you know, Padmasambhava, the great, you know, the great tantric tradition of Buddhism, right? The guy had, you know, five lovers and probably many others, and he was definitely not a celibate, you know, and the cultural hero of Bhutan, you know, this other great yogi, you know, Bhutan, the divine madman, Drukpa Kanle, okay, another, you know, great lover of women and many consorts. And they were drinking and they were using psychedelics and you know, drugs and so forth and so on, even if originally the actual historical Buddha never, you know, used any of these tools, and rather he was a fairly strict celibate. But at the end of the journey, without worrying, is he right, is he wrong, do I need to feel guilty, is God judging me, you know, you live and you do the practice according to whichever culture and tradition you are in, and then at a certain stage, the the desire for, is called the Kama Rupa, the realm of desire, will gradually melt. You don't need to think about it. So your job is clear. You do what you need to do. The Abrahamic God chose David to be the king of Israel, one of the great kings of Israel. Was it David a saint? No, he was a womanizer and a drunk. So why God chose him and so many of the other great cultural heroes? Well, because, coming back to our culture, God doesn't choose good men. God chooses men that are good for the job. And you know what is your job. You know the work of the spiritual practice. And you don't need to worry or be concerned with the rest of your nature, because you will naturally be put in order at his own time. If you do an honest work with yourself, eventually, yes, you will arrive at the point, maybe in this life, maybe in another life, if you believe in such things, where all of these other desires for food, for sex, for fame, for whatever is it, I don't know what, smoking and drinking, they will go. But trying obsessively to control these desires, thinking that that spiritual practice, is a gross misunderstanding and a futile effort, which very often yield opposite result, create strong narcissistic identities in the other way, of purity, of perfection, of goodness, and instead focus on what is the work, and the rest will naturally happen.
So we've talked about the what of spirituality, and this has been really great in-depth insights. I appreciate them a lot. I've been processing as we're talking. What is the point of it? Because so if we talk about filling Sing Chi the Dantian, fill the Dantian, that's not going to make you spiritual, get you toward a spirituality. But people do it. Their choice maybe is to become more healthy. And martial arts, they want self-defense or whatever, and many of them don't work for self-defense because they're, again, our illusions and our projections onto these practices. But spirituality specifically, I think, okay, here's the practice, have agency over your thoughts, and yourself. Then the desires for all these things, they fall away and you have clear thought. Does this also bring the clear union with the so-called divine? So what is the purpose of getting to that level?
Well, what's the alternative? I mean, it's
what's the alternative, right?
Yeah, what's the alternative? To be devoured by your own recurring thoughts, right, and unconscious forces to the bitter end of your life, to be compelled toward what you believe is a destiny, which is not a destiny, just the fulfillment of unconscious patterns of behavior and thoughts that you have no control of, and then very often don't exactly lead to happy places. I mean, what's the alternative? It's not even what's the purpose, it's what's the alternative, right?
Yeah.
And so, again, agency, sovereignty, freedom, for me, that's good enough. Then, whatever, cosmic love, participation with God, I mean, those are all beautiful words, enlightenment, but let's be honest, it's like, I don't know.
Yeah. We have no way of knowing. It's another construct, another thought, another projection.
I don't know. It's like, yes, of course, when you do proper meditation and engage in spiritual practice, you have some incredible experiences. But is it really the experience that you're after? Well, then the question is,
I think a lot of people are after those altered states of consciousness.
That's what I said, that's consciousness is a dangerous word.
Right.
Because it's not about consciousness. Consciousness is a fickle thing.
Mm-hmm.
Even in Buddhism, it's still part of the aggregates. It's not a ultimate nature.
Okay.
Consciousness is the result of a process of aggregation of factors. It appears and disappears. It arises in the wake state and then it dissolves in your dream state, blah, blah, blah. It's not it. it is something that it's very plastic, and so it can be expanded, and you can have it expanded consciousness, restricted. It's not it.
Right.
Also, that's neti. Very carefully. In nowadays, people conscious know, if you study the classics and if you actually practice, you know that consciousness is also not this, not that. It's not you, not me, not myself. It's another something that arises because of certain, causes and conditions, right?
Mm.
So definitely to chase about higher state of consciousness, it's another great pitfall, is another profound delusion, and it's part of the fantasy of power. Fantasy of power sees in spirituality the superiority of consciousness because I have access to higher state of consciousness, to bliss, to ecstasy, okay, to communion with God. It's a trap. That's not the purpose of spirituality. Clearly. Okay, actually, it is considered one of the greatest obstacles, the obstacles of bliss, of searching. They call it ananda, or bliss. Is considered one of the greatest obstacles.
And yet, everybody tries to find the bliss state, and reach and achieve the bliss.
But that's not spirituality.
Right.
Let's make it. Let's put it on the list of what is not spiritual practice. Spirituality. It's not taking a psychedelic, and I live with a lot of shamans. I did a lot of work with psychedelics. They are an incredible tool, incredible experiences, very useful. But that's not what spirituality is about. It's not having, the visionary journey with psychedelic. No. Or the state of I where I understand everything and it's correct. No, it's not. That's not spiritual practice. So let's get that very clear out of the way. It's as far from spirituality as imagining to feel an imaginary tantiano spinning your chakras.
So do you put it under the category of experience seeking, but not spirituality?
That's part of the fantasy of power.
Yeah.
That's all part of the fantasy of power.
Power, yeah.
The thrill, seeking, thinking that spirituality is about experience and content of the experience. No, it's not. That's our consciousness that is hungry constantly for experiences and new content. And so if you think that spiritual practice is just more of the same, just more content, it's
right.
not. One more experience, and all the great masters, they say, well, at that level, cleaning the floor and visualizing the Buddhas and peeling and cutting onions, the same. Having vision of God and taking a shit, the same. It's one experience, another experience, it's just experience, it's content of experience. It's content of consciousness. That is not you, not me, not mine, not myself. And again, the discerning of everything that is not spirituality, leave the very dry essence that ignites. Only the dry essence can ignite and burst into the fire that is the spirit. The rest is wet wood. You can't do nothing with it.
So this leads me to a question of the people who wrote all of the old Taoist texts, Buddhist texts, mantras. Did all that come out of power grabbing and ego driving and projection of what they thought? Or were they just different ways to help people reach the spirit? What is spirituality? Because it seems millions of spiritual seekers aren't spiritual by these definitions and have lost the plot and the map, because they're getting locked up in the processes of experience.
Well, because spirituality is not found in books. Zhuangzi, one of the early Chinese philosophers, we are talking of 4th century BC, quotation, quote unquote, with a slight paraphrase, the books are the excrements of the ancestors.
Yeah.
Really, back then, spirituality is not found in books or what the Veda wrote or what this guy wrote and so forth and so on. the Gospels were written by people that never met Jesus. The Gospels were written 100,
Right.
150 years later or whatever, right? It's like spirituality is not found in books. And well, the people who wrote these things, or the Lao Tzu, or whatever, the Tao Te Ching, you say what intention they had. I mean, I have no idea. But I can say that with a certain, degree of confidence that in these writings you can discern, but sometimes you need to cherry pick, which it's not very nice. But sometimes you really need to cherry pick. You need to discern. There is some good, and there is also a lot of gunk, a lot of fluff, or sometimes a lot of just plain wrong. Which we come back the need of the relation. We grow through relationship and the relation with our experiences, with our journey, with the encounters we meet with the teacher, the relationship, chiefly the Buddha and all the jnana tradition of India, would say with yourself. You got to meet your own mind, and it's all there, not in books. Milarepa, one of the great saints of mystics of Tibet, he wrote incredible poems and too many beautiful things to quote, but it says, I study my own mind. I don't remember. It's like, and basically all the books that I need to read, it's my own mind, because I study my own mind. I mean, what else could I find written in some books out there? And so the invitation is just that. I mean, the Buddha said it plainly to the monks: go and sit under a tree, under a rock, in solitude, be a Mauna. Remember, Buddha was also known as Sakya Muni. Muni in Sanskrit, Mauna means the silent one. Go and sit in silence until not only your lips stop to talk, but your mind, the voices stop to talk. And there you will find the knowledge. The rest is just intellectual debate that can go on forever and leads nowhere.
Excellent. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you, Mark. You have a great, great day.
Talk to you soon.
Bye,
Okay.
bye, bye.
I hope you've enjoyed our conversation with David Verdesi as much as I have. Thank you very much, and please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I thank you for your support.